Welcome to another edition of Arroyo Live. From the Pasadena Media Center, I'm Joe Carbonetta. This program is produced by Pasadena Media to help enrich the community through informative and meaningful conversation. Remember, you can share your questions or comments with us anytime at arroyolive@pasadenamedia.org. Among the many laws, rules, and regulations which govern the state of California is a declaration that states the availability of housing is a matter of vital statewide importance, and the attainment of decent housing and a suitable living environment for all Californians is a priority of the highest order. At the local level, the housing element allows each city to prepare a community-specific approach to how and where housing will be addressed to meet the needs of the community. Tonight, we take a look at Pasadena's housing element and perhaps gain a little insight from some of those involved in its implementation. Please join me for Arroyo Live. This evening, my guests are Michelle White, Jill Shook, Rick Cole, and Margaret Munoz. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for being here tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joe.
I'd like to start out this evening's conversation by asking each of you to tell our viewers at home a little bit more about yourselves. And if you don't mind, I suppose we will go right back in the order of which you were introduced. So Michelle, I'd like to start with you.
Okay. I have been in Pasadena for about 4 decades, and I am the executive director of Affordable Housing Services, a corporation that does affordable housing for very low income individuals and households. And we do a fair amount of advocacy. I used to be with the Justice Department and a number of fair housing agencies, and I'm on the board of the NAACP, previously with the League of Women Voters, and a number of other groups.
I am the co-founding director of Making Housing and Community Happen, and I've been doing housing justice work with Michelle, who just introduced herself, for the last 25 years. And so we go way back. The roots were in Quakers, and we also are very faith-rooted, working with about 25 churches in the city. We have 7 teams working with churches in their underutilized land. About 47 churches right now that are interested in having affordable housing on their property. We do safe parking for those experiencing homelessness. We have a pilot program for that. We're doing some community development work on North Fair Oaks and a bunch of other stuff. Work with ADUs. But we love our work. It's also, like Michelle mentioned, involved with advocacy. And so we've seen a lot of approvals of different projects, over 200 units of affordable housing in the last couple of years. So we're really grateful for that. But yeah, I'm so happy to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. Rick, your turn.
Sure. Joe, I grew up in Pasadena, third generation Pasadenan, and had the honor of serving on our city council for 3 terms, including 2 years as mayor back in the early 90s. And then I pursued a career in executive management in city government as a city manager in nearby Azusa, Ventura up the coast, and Santa Monica on the west side. And during that time also was deputy mayor for the budget in the city of Los Angeles for a couple of years. Returning to Pasadena, where I've been gone for about 20 years, I became involved in this housing crisis that affects not only Southern California as a region, but our community particularly. Coming up on my 50th high school reunion, and many of my classmates have been displaced from living in the community that they grew up in. So I feel a tremendous sense of responsibility for continuing, for Pasadena to continue to be an inclusive community, particularly in light of a fairly shameful history of racial exclusion that I grew up with and that predated me, that my father experienced when he was going to high school with Jackie Robinson. And now the Mayor Gordo has given me the honor of asking me to be his first special advisor with a focus on housing. So I've been working with Mayor Gordo, his field rep, Vanya de la Cuba, the chair of the mayor's housing task force, another former mayor, Bill Bogard, as well as our city staff, the city manager, the director of planning, the director of housing. I've also been involved with a number of the groups that have been active, including Making Housing Community Happen, Pasadena's Organizing for Progress, and Abundant Housing Los Angeles. So those are some of the background that I bring to this discussion of the housing element.
All right. Well, thank you also for joining us this evening. And Margaret.
Great, thank you. So my name is Margaret Munoz. I am an urban planner and I graduated from the USC Sol Price School of Public Policy. I previously worked with Abundant Housing LA, which is how I became to be a member of the Pasadena Affordable Housing Coalition. And now I work with Phil Burns at the Arroyo Group, which is a planning and urban design firm based in Old Town Pasadena. And I'm a graduate of PUSD schools, and I'm really happy to be here. Thank you.
Well, again, thank you all for joining us this evening. As we begin the conversation, there's a term that if you follow city government, local government, even the state government, you will hear from time to time, and that is the housing element. But I would like to set the record straight on exactly what the housing element is before we really dive into this conversation. With that in mind, I'm wondering if anybody wants to take a stab at explaining what the housing element is.
Sure, I think you have to start that in California, our state requires every community, and there are 482 cities in California, to have a general plan. That's really a blueprint for the future development of the city. It involves allowing for new development in terms of land use, but also transportation, preparing for natural disasters, and ensuring the safety of the community. So every community is supposed to have a general plan, and Pasadena's general plan has been very important in the development of the city over the past few decades. As part of the state requirement for a general plan, there are a number of required elements that must be completed by every state, and the only one of those mandatory elements that goes for state review is the housing element. Why is that? Because frankly, over the last several decades, local governments have not produced adequate housing. That's the principal reason why we have a housing crisis in Southern California, and for that matter in Northern California as well. And so the state has fairly specific requirements for the housing element. But the housing element is really a plan. It's a plan that under state law is supposed to meet the housing needs of all of your residents. There's a number of pieces that we'll get into that are required. One of them is you have to show an inventory of sites that could be developed over a cycle of 8 years. That's how every 8 years you're supposed to update your housing element. And you're required to show the state that you have adequate space in your community that's appropriately zoned to build enough housing to meet your share of the regional need for new housing. And not just housing in general, but also housing for moderate income people, for low income people, and even for very low income households. And that process of allocating what each community's fair share ought to be is a controversial one. It often gets the most attention in housing element updates, but it's by no means the only or even perhaps the most important piece of it. Because again, a housing element by state law is supposed to be a blueprint for the community to meet the housing needs of all of the residents. And that would include not just building new housing, but also in ensuring the housing security of existing residents, and even addressing the displacement, the involuntary displacement of existing residents who no longer can afford to live here or who've been evicted from their apartments. So
Well,
the housing element is meant to be a very important document. Unfortunately, in most communities, there hasn't been a lot of attention paid to it. That's changed in Pasadena in this cycle. There's a tremendous amount of public attention, primarily because there are a number of housing advocates who said the city needs to take this very seriously.
well, we've certainly seen a lot of discussion, especially recently, about housing. It's become more of a political hot button than ever with the onset of COVID and the loss of jobs. But there has always been a concern, especially here in the state of California, about the lack of housing. And I'd like for each of you to perhaps give me your input on this, but how is the housing element addressing the lack of affordable housing in the state of California?
I was part of a group that noted the fact that the housing element had not been adopted in a timely way, and legal services actually came around and sued the city for the adoption of its housing element. So that was interesting. It didn't result in a lot of negative things happening to the city, but it made it clear that the city had to begin to address its affordable housing needs. That was, I think, close to 25 or 30 years ago. So although this cycle has been very fraught with things related to COVID and lack of affordable housing, the housing element has been something that has been a part of what the advocates do as just part of making sure that the city addresses affordable housing needs and those of the renters. Now, I'm a renter. I live in Northwest Pasadena. There was a time when Northwest Pasadena was the only place that Black and brown people were permitted to live. They certainly couldn't buy outside of Northwest Pasadena. Now we're in a situation where renters, especially low-income renters, are being ousted and displaced out of Northwest Pasadena as well as other parts of the city. So I approached this as somebody who is interested in what happens to low-income renters in the city, because as an African American, I know that 60% of the residents who live in Pasadena who are African American are also renters. And that's equally true with regard, well, just about equally true with regard to Latinos. So Black and brown people have a special interest in making sure that the city meets its responsibility with regard to not displacing people, making sure that there is enough land and enough affordable housing, and that there are protections in place that will make sure that the people who've lived here for generations especially can continue to do so.
Michelle, does the housing element merely focus on the idea of available housing, or is it more focused on affordable housing? And what does it define as affordable?
It focuses on all kinds of housing. It goes from very low and extremely low income housing that is available to extremely low income persons, right on up to luxury housing or market rate housing. So it is meant to be a plan for all aspects of housing within the city, zoning, code enforcement, any number of things, both rental and home ownership opportunities are addressed, etc. My main problem with the housing element has always been that it is very responsive to, at least Pasadena's housing element, is very responsible to, or responsive to the state requirements, but it is not very responsive to the local requirements. So we get in there, we make arguments for things like rent control and just cause evictions and a bunch of other policies that ought to be addressed in this document, and they never see the light of day. So we continue to work on it, but our policies need to better reflect what is happening within the city and how to protect those persons who live here.
Yeah, I'd like to speak to that a little bit. I really appreciate what Michelle and Rick have said. The other added aspect to this particular cycle of the housing element is what's called affirmatively furthering fair housing, which addresses racial inequities. And so I'm very pleased that our state has added that. It'll be interesting to see how much our city actually takes that seriously. I'm grateful for cities like Seattle that have made sure, like one of the policies that we're hoping will happen sooner than later is to allow churches to have the right zoning so they can build on their underutilized land. And so what Seattle has done is they've made sure that, especially in the downtown area, any church has the right zoning with the goal of racial equity. In that city, about 70% of the Blacks lived in the area. Now it's less than 10. And so they're doing some significant things to turn that around, not only with housing, but also to make sure those people hired to build the housing will be minority owned, so it can become wealth generating. So there's all kinds of tools within a housing element. It's not only about housing, but primarily about housing, but it's really supposed to bring about equality. One of the new policies we're hoping to get into this housing element is a community land trust, which is another way to create wealth generation and provide access to those that historically have not had access to home ownership. And so, so that our nonprofit is working on developing a community land trust, and we're hoping that can be in this element. We've advocated for it. We've yet to see that it's actually listed in this draft. So we'll continue to try to get it in there, along with rent control and some of the other things we've mentioned.
For those who haven't followed, housing element and housing element law, Jill just talked about affirmatively furthering fair housing. That means a lot to people who pay attention to federal and state law, but to the average person, what does that even mean? What that means in lay language is, as Michelle noted earlier, Black and brown people in Pasadena, as in many communities across America, not just in the South, were confined to specific neighborhoods, either through law or restrictive covenants that were enforced by law. And the result of that is that our neighborhoods across America are rigidly segregated, not just by income, but also by race. And in 1968, the United States government passed a law for fair housing. And it said that the local communities that were segregated, like Pasadena, and Pasadena was adjudicated in federal court as being segregated back when I was a high school student, communities like us have an affirmative duty to make sure that there's opportunities across the entire city for people of all races to live. And there's an old saying from the French from 200 years ago that the law, in its magnificent equality, forbids the rich as well as the poor from sleeping under bridges. And it makes the point that the law treating everyone equally is not always enough. That if the law treated people unequally, as it did for so many decades and even centuries in our country, that the law has and we have a duty to change that, and not just to take the past injustices and leave them in place, but to affirmatively address them. So you note that new housing, particularly new affordable housing, has not been spread evenly throughout the city. That it's been concentrated in neighborhoods where there are already low-income or moderate-income people, and our wealthiest neighborhoods remain rigidly segregated. And so that's what Jill was talking about, is what are we going to do about that in the next 8 years? And the state is saying, you've got to present a plan. So that's an important, I think, clarification. This is a federal law that's been on the books since 1968. This is a state law, and this is a local responsibility, as Michelle and Jill have emphasized.
Based on what I have heard so far, my impression is that most of you on the panel do not believe that Pasadena has done a very good job so far in its execution of the idea behind the housing element. With that in mind, I'm wondering if anyone on our panel knows...
Joe, let me clarify one thing.
Okay.
People on the call and people in the community and people in local government on staff and elected officials have done much more than surrounding communities. That said, there's a lot more to do, and to be less exclusionary than some of the most exclusionary communities, in Southern California, is only, it's like my old boss Eric Garcetti used to say, it's like being the tallest building in Canoga Park. It's not, it's to say that we've done much better than our neighbors is good, but we have a housing crisis that is displacing families that live here, that go to church here, that sent their kids to school here, that contribute their tax money here. We are losing them because they can't afford to live here. And new families who are working here are having to commute from 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 miles away in Southern California traffic, because there's no housing near the jobs. So these are real problems. So Pasadena's done more than its share of affordable housing and good policy. 20 years ago, the city adopted inclusionary zoning, which requires developers either to include affordable housing with market rate or to pay money to allow that to be developed elsewhere. And that law has been improved because of the advocacy of some of the people on this call within the last 5 years. But there is so much more to be done. So I just want to set the record straight. Pasadena's done a lot compared to other cities, but it is not done enough compared to the gravity of the crisis.
I'm wondering if anyone on the panel has a statistic readily available that would indicate the percentage of affordable housing in Pasadena relative to the market rate housing that's currently available or in development.
I know that there's about 1,400 units of Section 8 and other affordable housing in the city of Pasadena. But if you compare that to what the need is, we have 527 folks that were counted as homeless in 2020. We have 700 students in our school district that are counted as homeless. We have 19% of Pasadena City College students that say they're experiencing homelessness. We have 23,000 on our Section 8 waiting list. So when that number was brought to the city council, one of our city council members said, I think that's a mistake. I think there's too many zeros. And and our housing director, Bill Wong, said, nope, that's the number. The need is huge. And so I'm very grateful that this time around, the housing element RHNA numbers, the Regional Housing Needs Assessment, is 9,429, with almost 6,000 of that number for affordable units. Now that's finally closer to the real need. And so I'm very grateful. That probably won't meet the full need, but it's certainly closer. And we definitely need our city to get serious about this and do the zoning and the hard work of making sure that affordable housing really can happen. We're looking at about 10 churches right now in Pasadena. If they were given permission to build on their underutilized land, that would supply about 1,000 units. But right now, there's been a myth that the zoning is set up that you don't need to change it. That's just completely false. None of the churches interested north of the freeway have the proper zoning, and they're either zoned commercial or they have such low density that the funding sources needed for affordable housing, which is typically built with tax credits, doesn't apply. You have to start with at least 40 to 50 units on a site, and then you can win the tax credits. So we clearly need to seriously look at policies that will get the job done. And it's possible if we want that to happen as a city.
I actually do have the numbers from the last planning cycle for like how much housing was built in each income level. And so over the last 8 years, like the last planning cycle for the housing element, the 5th cycle, about 3,004 units were built. And of that, 246 were for lower income households, 142 were for moderate income households, and shockingly, 2,616 were for above moderate income households. So it's so that means that like over those 8 years, only 8.2% of those 3,004 units were built for lower income households, and then moderate's only 142 more.
That's a pretty sobering statistic, I would say. I would like to ask another question. Time and time again, when the discussion of affordable housing is brought to the table in any community, there are those who argue against it for fear of an increase in crime and an overall general degradation of a community. What would you say to those who use those as arguments against more affordable housing?
Anybody who argues that really has not seen a well-run, nonprofit, usually affordable housing complex. Jill will be able to cite the studies that deal with the fact that when you've got decent, affordable housing in the community, the whole community rises. It is a better way of doing business to make sure that people have enough money and enough housing to meet their needs. What comes to mind right away is that we had over I think it was a 10-year period, we had a rise in the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, of about 12%, but the rents rose 32%. So, we not only need the units, but we also need the policies that take care of the people who live in those communities. And I have lived in Northwest Pasadena, which is supposed to be where all of the affordable housing is, by choice for most of my time in Pasadena. It's a wonderful place to live. And suddenly this little gold mine or this gem has been discovered by yuppies and other people who are in a position to afford to pay more for housing. And we've got people living there who have lived there for decades, who no longer can compete. And as a result, what happens is you've got people who are earning a lot more money, who can come in and they pay 32% more for rent than had been paid previously, and they move people out and they push them out. So this would not be a crime-ridden community if you wouldn't have these people who have a lot more money moving into the community if it was crime ridden. We do have crime issues, but so does the city, so does the rest of the city. So I know that Jill is champing at the bit to talk about studies.
Well, I don't know if I can quote a lot of studies. Thanks for your confidence in me, Michelle, but I certainly can speak from my own experience. I also live in Northwest Pasadena. I bought my house here in '94 for only $143,000. And there was a home that just sold one block away for $900,000 last month. And so that may seem, I mean, that's really good news for that homeowner. They're making a windfall, but it's certainly not good news for others that just can't afford to stay in the city. And so I just see that affordable housing, people drive by it all the time. They have no idea that it's all affordable. It's absolutely gorgeous. If you're going to get affordable housing passed, you have fabulous architects. It goes through design review. It's expensive to build affordable housing because it's so well built. It's built completely environmental. It's the most environmental housing out there. It's built with tax credits, and about 400 points are on those you have to score really high on in order to get tax credits. And about a third of those are all environmental. So it's amazing stuff. We have tours. We've had mayors from adjacent city hop on our homeless to house bus tours so they can get inside of beautiful affordable housing. They can see how it not only houses people that would normally be on the street or people that would normally drive an hour away to come to work, but it brings beauty and it brings investment. So typically, because Pasadena has what's called the 20-20-20 rule, where 20% of all the laborers to build it have to be local, 20% of all the contracts local, 20% of all the materials local. So it brings investment. Just one affordable housing complex on North Fair Oaks that hardly anyone knows it's affordable, and it's like garden apartments, but that one apartment building of 69 units has brought in $6 million of investment into the community. So we just want to get people inside of these buildings. We want them to see how beautiful it is. Affordable housing is listed as one of the national crime deterrents. So there's a whole lot of myths out there that we're constantly seeking to dispel about affordable housing. And we hope that those listening today will do the research and find out for themselves and get inside of these buildings and see how beautiful they are.
And another thing I think to keep in mind, Joe, because I think both Michelle and Jill have made eloquent points about the prejudice that's involved in these fears, is not just that affordable housing is an attractive investment in a neighborhood. I used to go when I was a council member when people were concerned about affordable housing, and I would take them, as Jill's just mentioned, to a neighborhood and say, okay, pick out the affordable, the crime-ridden, run-down affordable housing project. And never once did they get it right on the first, second, or third try, right? And they were typically absentee landlords, market rate developments that were the ones that they picked out as being the eyesores. And then when they finally said, "Oh, that one is the affordable housing," it caused people to really rethink some of those prejudices. But here's the reality, Joe. It's not just that affordable housing looks good. It's that everybody has a stake in this. Right now, for a 2-bedroom apartment in Los Angeles, the average price of a 2-bedroom apartment, your household needs to make $99,420 a year for an average 2-bedroom apartment in Los Angeles. And by the way, the rents in Pasadena are slightly higher than that. They're at $2,532 is the current average. So you have to make over $100,000 to be able to rent the average 2-bedroom apartment in Pasadena. Who makes that, right? We're not talking about just homeless people, just people of very low income, folks who are on disability or temporary government support. We're talking about working couples with kids who are desperate to find a roof over their head within 40 or 50 miles of where they work, in restaurants, in hotels, in offices, who teach, who do all these things that are absolutely necessary for a community to survive. And the big problem is affordable housing for vast amounts of people. By the way, again, you have to make over $100,000 to be able to afford a 2-bedroom apartment. The median income in Pasadena for a household is $83,000. You have to make $20,000 more than the average to afford a 2-bedroom apartment. That's why people are living in garages. That's why people are overcrowded 2 families to a 2-bedroom apartment. That's why why families are crowding into 1-bedroom apartments with families with children. That's a reality. People say, well, we can't grow anymore. The people are already here. They're just not adequately housed. And as Jill said earlier, 527 of them don't have a house at all.
A few moments ago, Michelle also raised an interesting point, although I don't know if that was her primary focus in her example about the gym. But typically, where we go into an area and see high property values, the cost of doing business within such a community is usually elevated as well. I was wondering if the housing element and its eye toward affordable housing does anything for the cost of living in the communities where that affordable housing is built.
Not this version, if we allow it to stand, because Pasadena passed $15 an hour increase and applauded itself for having done that. And I think, we were one of the earlier cities to adopt that minimum wage. But $15 an hour is just above the poverty level. And we've got people who need a higher income than that, obviously, to remain in the city unless we do something about affordable housing. So we need to address rent control. We need to address how we keep people from having astronomical increases in their rent and address that as part of the housing element. We raised that with the drafters. They put something in and they made it sound as if we in fact are in the process of studying that. I know of no study that has ever taken place in the city of Pasadena for the last 20 years. And to put that into the housing element as something that is ongoing is really a misstatement at best. So we need to address things like that. We need to address other ways in which we can keep people housed. And it's not just a matter of money. We're supposed to do for each one of our multifamily dwellings, we're supposed to do a survey and inspection every 4 years to make sure that it's quality housing. We don't have enough inspectors in the planning division to actually make that happen. So when we went around and did our surveys around rent control, we found that there were a lot of places that just don't meet code. So the city needs to address that level of code enforcement as part of the housing element too. Margaret's got to jump in here because I know.
I was just going to say the same thing. I see her nodding in agreement with just about everything that's been said, but she's remained noticeably mum on most of these questions. And Margaret, we would like to get your opinions on a lot of this. I know you have some factual information there. You pulled out a gigantic data sheet a few moments ago and gave us actual statistics on the number of affordable homes relative to new construction in the area. So please, we'd like to hear your thoughts on this also.
I can speak to, I just finished up writing a bit of a letter that we're going to be releasing fairly soon. So stay tuned for that. But what we discovered was that first, the housing element draft as it stands now really needs a lot of strengthening in terms of goals and policies and programs. We just felt that everything was either something that had been continued from the past element that is already being done in the city and doesn't really bring anything innovative to the table, or it's something that the city plans to explore, such as like the congregational land overlay. But, we would like that to be explored now rather than, when they say it. I think they said, how many years did they say, Jill?
2025.
2025. So, it seems that like the innovative ideas are just being pushed in terms of just like exploring it and not like any commitments, like no commitments are being made. And so we really just want, some solid commitments and some solid language around some innovative new policies that are going to get affordable housing built to the level that we need it, which is about like 5,000 units of affordable housing for the RHNA cycle. And then the second thing is we really felt like the site inventory lacked a true analysis of the realistic development capacity. And so, we read through the entire site analysis, and that's basically just where they list like where they're imagining that these units will come from. And so they project how many ADUs they think are going to get built, how many projects they already have in development, building permits, approvals. And then areas they think that either are vacant or underutilized and they think will redevelop. And while we appreciate them, putting in all that effort into finding all those sites, 9,000 units, that's a lot of sites. We just felt like the analysis of whether these sites will actually redevelop was lacking to an extent. And we would really like to see that dug down into, because, if we're saying that these units are going to redevelop, we need to be sure because we don't want to fall short on our RHNA for the sake of people that are being forcibly displaced now and in the future.
Yeah, I'd like to follow up on that. I really appreciate Margaret and the organization that she's with, the Arroyo group. They do excellent research, and they've been a great help to our nonprofit over the years, making us look great. So thank you, Margaret. But I'm just going to give you the example of ADUs, accessory dwelling units. And so this is about my fourth housing element, I think. And so accessory dwelling units, those granny flats, we saw in the housing element, I think it was 3 or 4 cycles ago, that they were going to address that, but they didn't have a date or a deadline. And so it rolled over to the next housing element, the next 8 years. And again, no date and deadline. And finally, our group that Michelle was part of, we called HCD, the Housing and Community Development for California, and said, we need some dates and deadlines in this housing element. So finally, the study for ADUs was going to be conducted in 2016. And so we were able to go to the city hall and say, look at, how can we help you make sure that the study is done in 2016 like you're supposed to. And so they didn't have staff necessarily to do all the research. So we did the research. We worked with Fuller interns and we did all the research. Yeah. So not all of it, but a lot of it. And then we got nowhere with ADUs for years, and finally went to the state and started working with state lawmakers. And today the city is like, we love ADUs. They won an award for one of the best pilot programs to do affordable ADUs, which is highly unusual. And that's what our ADU committee is working on, is to make ADUs affordable. And so, so there's a lot of creative ideas, that we need to push forward. And we should be able to build over garages for ADUs. Most cities allow that. Our city does not. And we should have small lot ordinance. That was in the last cycle and we never addressed it. So those are those cute little, bungalow courts that we all love that started here in Pasadena. The first one was here. And so, but it's not allowed. And so how do we make it possible to combine a couple lots, put a bunch of cute little cottages on there, maybe have them go 2 stories, so it's a better use of the land and the infrastructure that we have. So that never got addressed in this last cycle. And so we need to hold the city accountable. And like Margaret was saying, we've got to make sure it really gets done, and not just adequate sites, but adequate policies and funding. Funding's a big part of it, as well as adequate, like school districts. That the zoning isn't fixed yet to allow schools to have housing on their property, and it's a great solution. We've got teachers. Last I looked at the statistic, 55% of the teachers are driving between 45 minutes to 2 hours one way, and yet we have schools that have closed. And so why don't we get housing there for teachers that they can afford? They can purchase the home but not the land, accrue some equity, and live close by, and generate some income for the school district at the same time. So there's some real creative, great ideas, but for some reason they're not getting in the element and they're not moving forward. So
I have, Joe, some good news on that, though.
Yeah.
Okay. The draft was the first draft, and we've talked a lot about its shortcomings. But the city council unanimously directed staff not only to move that draft forward, but to address the shortcomings that were identified, and to use the time that we have right now while the state is reviewing the draft to address the issues that we've been talking about this hour. That was, again, a unanimous vote, and the motion made by Councilmember Rivas was to have specific, tangible, measurable outcomes, right? So not just vague promises, but things that you could measure, and we could hold ourselves as a community accountable for achieving them. And she specifically mentioned the recommendations of the Pasadena Affordable Housing Coalition as what she called a good starting point to take a look at, seconded by Councilmember Kennedy and unanimously adopted. Similarly, Mayor Gordo, who impaneled this housing task force under the chairing of former Mayor Bogard, they have been directed to spend this time working on specific recommendations that can go in the next iteration of the housing element. And so those meetings are being scheduled as we speak. And Mayor Gordo's made clear to the staff that he strongly supports a set of recommendations that can come to the council for them to consider. And the Planning Commission, when they heard the draft, made a number of specific recommendations and or objections to the existing draft. So the City Council, the Planning Commission, the Housing Task Force, and as you've heard, many voices and organizations in the community see the need to strengthen the housing element. So I think there's a tremendous amount of goodwill in that regard. But for anyone listening to all of this, this is the time to weigh in, to make your voice heard, and not just to express your opinion, but to roll up your sleeves and to work with other people to find solutions, right? We have a lot of people in our society these days who think that It's okay to just say, I don't want that, or I want that. And then if they don't get what they want, then they think democracy sucks, or and democracy isn't like that. You don't always get what you want. You have to roll up your sleeves and work with other people who have different viewpoints and come to solutions. And I think that's the great opportunity for Pasadena residents now, is to step forward. We have a real crisis. It's not something that anybody's made up. For families, Michelle mentioned the minimum wage. To afford that 2-bedroom apartment in Pasadena, you have to have 3 people making minimum wage, right? For the 1 2-bedroom apartment. In fact, you need more than 3 people to do that. So there's a real crisis. Having our teachers, as Jill just mentioned, driving 45 minutes or 2 hours to get to work to teach our kids, that's for what we pay. How do you attract and retain the quality teachers that our kids deserve and our community's future depends upon? So for all those reasons, it's time for people to get involved, and not to say, well, this is something for someone else to solve, or I don't care, do whatever you want, just don't build it in my neighborhood. That's not responsible citizenship. As a community, we have to come together and find good solutions. And I think now is the time. The Planning Commission, the Housing Task Force, the City Council are all saying this is the time to strengthen our housing element. And so I appreciate the mayor's leadership on this, and I think, and I certainly appreciate the citizens who've moved this issue forward. Now is the time to seize that initiative.
Pasadena, being part of LA County, finds itself in something of a unique position at the moment when it comes to the potential for developing more affordable housing, in that there are large areas of the community that were once designated for use with the 710 freeway and actually are now sitting unused since the 710 freeway project has officially been ended. Does the housing element have any plans for any of that property to be repurposed, used for more affordable housing?
I actually took a look before at the draft element, and they do have some mentions of the 710 stub. They do mention in program 11, they mention that like the Caltrans homes along the 710. They state that during the planning period, they will work with Caltrans to target the sale of those properties for creative housing types for lower income and special needs households. And additionally, in program 6, they do mention that during the planning period, they will study the potential of capping portions of the 210 and 710 stub to create additional land area for housing. And they say knit back together the community division created by the original freeway construction. So they do make 2 mentions of it. Mm-hmm.
I think when you say, Margaret, knit back together, so if you look at the area where Parsons now sits, that was a thriving, mostly Black community that was displaced. And then a lot of the areas where Old Town now sits was African American. You can see Friendship Baptist Church, Black church. It's like, oh, what's that doing there? And because that's finally a little remnant left of a thriving Black community that's been displaced. And so all of that area should not just address affordable housing, but racial justice. There should be history. There should be plaques that talk about the history and how we can make right past wrongs, and aspects of reparations to begin to see affordable housing for especially for those people of color. Thankfully, our local preference policy was just changed so that 20% of people that have been displaced have the opportunity to move back into the city. So we need to exercise that and make sure that people have a chance to come back that have been displaced. And those are primarily people of color that have all been displaced. So
Well, we are certainly coming into the closing moments of the show. I wanted to seize upon something that Rick said in one of his earlier responses also. He discussed the idea that many people who work within the city cannot actually afford to live in the city and thereby are forced to make long commutes. Has there ever been any consideration, and is it even possible in the housing element, to perhaps give priority for some of that affordable housing to people who already work within the confines of the city?
Well, if you take a look at the vouchers that are given out for housing, the idea behind them is to keep the costs of rent to 30% of someone's income. One of the priorities included in that would be people who meet the income level, those persons who are disabled, but a higher priority is given to those persons who both live and work in the city. So as the city gives out preferences for who should live within certain areas and whether they, not within certain areas, but within complexes, and they have vouchers available, they include in that the ability to, if you can work and live in the city, you're given a higher priority.
And it expands not just to those with vouchers, but any affordable housing. If even if it's affordable homeownership, the priority goes to those who live and work in Pasadena, with 20% of those that have been displaced.
I'm afraid we have reached the close of our show. We've actually run out of time this evening, but I would like to thank each of you for joining us. Your input has certainly been appreciated. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank my guests, Ms. Michelle White, Ms. Jill Shook, Mr. Rick Cole, and Ms. Margaret Munoz. Thank you again, all of you, for joining us this evening.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Joe. You did a great job.
For our viewers at home, if there are topics you would like to see addressed on our program, you can email them to us at arroyolive@pasadenamedia.org, and we may include them in a future broadcast. Until next time, this has been Arroyo Live. I'm Joe Carbonetta. Thank you for watching, and good night.